Price moves actively, but distance does not hold. The session forms at the lower boundary of the April 8th U.S. session box. Movement appears clear, then breaks down. The April 8th Asia session forms directly at the lower edge of the prior U.S. session structure. It does not create a new area. It inherits location. This is important. Sessions do not start in empty space. They form on top of prior interaction. Even if earlier session memory is removed from the chart, structure still follows it. The session forms where price has already been processed before. This is session memory. From this location, distance opens downward. Price moves below the boundary, but cannot stay there. Reaction appears quickly. The move fails to hold outside structure. Price returns back into the prior session box. This is rejection. Rejection means price cannot remain outside a level long enough to establish a new position. Now the sequence begins. The session forms at the boundary. Distance opens from that location. Price reaches the next level. Reaction appears. It returns again. The same sequence repeats. This is rotation. Rotation means price moves back and forth between boundaries instead of leaving the area. Now the movement becomes tighter. Price moves below the session boundary again, but returns faster than before. This is compression. Compression means space is becoming limited. Price reaches boundaries faster and has less room to travel. Volatility is still visible, but it is happening inside containment. Containment means price is trapped inside a previously formed structure. Now observe what changes. Pullbacks deepen before stabilizing. Continuation stalls earlier. Reaction happens faster. This is behavioral friction. Friction is what makes movement harder to continue. The structure becomes heavy. The session forms again at the same lower boundary area. From this position, distance still appears available, but only briefly. Price reaches the next boundary. Reaction appears again. It does not hold outside. It returns. This is repetition of failure. Failure frequency increases. Moves begin to lose strength earlier. Continuation cannot extend the same distance. This changes execution conditions. Distance expectation compresses. Tolerance becomes narrower. There is less room for movement to remain stable. Now the key layer. Even though this chart looks simplified, previous session memory is still controlling where each session forms. If you go back and reconstruct earlier session boxes, you will see that each new session aligns with prior boundaries. This is not coincidence. It is structure being reused. This is why price repeatedly reacts at the same levels. And this is why movement cannot escape easily. Now the structure tightens further. Price continues to move around the same boundary. It moves below, returns inside, moves above, returns again. This is rotation inside compression. If sessions continue forming at this same boundary, distance remains limited. If price begins to hold outside this lower boundary, the environment shifts. Execution conditions remain in transition. Price continues to move, but continuation does not extend. The April 9th U.S. session forms around the lower boundary of the April 8th Asia session. The location shifts slightly, but not structurally. The session forms at the lower edge of the prior Asia session structure. From this location, distance opens upward. Price moves toward the upper boundary of the April 8th Asia session. It reaches that level. Reaction appears. But this time, the move attempts to continue. Price pushes through the upper boundary. It moves toward the upper boundary of the April 8th U.S. session. But again, it cannot establish position there. This is another failure to hold outside structure. Expansion appears, but does not persist. This is relocation attempt without acceptance. Relocation means price moves into a new area, but acceptance requires staying there. Without acceptance, relocation fails. Price returns back into the prior range. Now observe the behavior. Moves begin to slow earlier. Pullbacks extend deeper. Continuation loses distance faster. This is increasing friction. Each attempt requires more support to continue. But that support is not present. Holding pressure increases. The structure becomes more sensitive. Small reactions now disrupt movement. This is important. When structure becomes sensitive, tolerance becomes narrow. There is less room for price to move before failing. Now the sequence continues. The session forms at a location where distance is still available. From this position, the next boundary becomes reachable. Price reaches that boundary. Reaction begins. Movement slows. It does not hold outside. It returns into structure. The same sequence repeats. This is rotation. Rotation now occurs between the lower boundary of the April 8th Asia session and the upper boundary of the same structure. The range becomes defined. Price moves between these two levels and returns again. This is containment. Containment remains active. Even though expansion attempts appear, they do not establish new structure. Now compression increases. Each move reaches the boundary faster than before. This is compression tightening. Compression reduces distance. Distance reduction increases interaction. Interaction increases failure. Failure increases friction. This is the cycle. Now observe how the session aligns. The April 9th U.S. session forms on top of the April 8th Asia session boundary. This again shows session memory. Sessions stack on top of prior interaction. They do not choose random locations. This is why structure repeats. Now execution conditions change further. Distance expectation compresses again. Failure frequency increases again. Tolerance narrows further. Moves must be cleaner to sustain. But they are not. If sessions continue forming inside this defined range, distance remains limited. If price begins to establish position above the April 8th U.S. session boundary, tolerance must expand. Environment is still processing. Price stabilizes briefly, but movement remains restricted. The April 9th Asia session forms between the lower boundary of the March 17th U.S. session and the middle of the April 8th U.S. session. This is not a new area. It is a layered location. The session forms on top of multiple prior boundaries and also above a descending pressure line. This creates conflict. Price now moves around the lower boundary of this new session. It does not move away from it. It rotates around it. This is boundary-centered movement. From this location, distance opens toward the upper part of the structure. Price moves upward, but cannot extend far. Reaction appears quickly. The move slows earlier than before. Continuation stalls again. It returns toward the lower boundary. This is repeated failure. Now compression becomes dominant. Price moves less distance before reacting. Boundaries are reached faster. This is tightening space. Compression is now controlling behavior. Rotation continues inside this compressed space. Price moves between nearby boundaries and returns again. This is rotation under compression. Relocation attempts become weaker. Price still travels across levels, but cannot stay outside them. This is relocation without persistence. Containment remains active. Even though movement appears dynamic, structure remains unchanged. Now observe the deeper layer. Each session continues to form at locations where previous interaction already existed. Even though earlier session memory is not visible on this chart, it is still active. If you reconstruct those earlier sessions, you will see alignment across all session anchors. This is how structure builds through time. Sessions do not define structure. They reveal where structure already exists. Now behavior becomes more fragile. Pullbacks deepen further. Reaction becomes faster. Continuation fails earlier. This is increasing friction. Distance expectation compresses again. Tolerance becomes even narrower. Holding pressure builds further. Each move requires more support to continue, but fails quickly. This is instability inside containment. Now the structure remains locked. Price continues to rotate. Fails to hold outside. Returns again. The sequence does not change. If sessions continue forming inside this compressed and overlapping structure, distance remains limited. If price begins to establish position outside these boundaries and hold, tolerance must expand. Execution conditions remain in transition.